morning, warm gun. Thank you, my friends. They threatened to throw rotten fruit at me, but instead they said hello. That's good. Okay, so I'm sure most of you guys grew up understanding or having heard the story of Cinderella, right? We all know the deal. The evil stepsisters rip apart Cinderella's dress. The fairy godmother comes along and rescues her and gets her all dolled up. She goes to the ball. She meets the prince. Wonderful things happen. And then she has to run home before the magic runs out at midnight. And then the prince, not knowing her name, uses the glass slipper that she leaves behind to find her. And he goes around town trying the glass slipper on a whole bunch of different women. Now, even when I was little, this strained credibility a bit. And I thought, that is the world's worst job interview process. Who fits the glass slipper? Because, I mean, really, does the prince want to marry somebody who is dumb enough to wear glass on her feet? That's not really a good starting point. That's not going to get you the best candidate for that job. And there are a lot of ladies with the same size feet. So unless Cinderella was a 7-foot drag queen, chances are lots of people would fit those shoes. So not really the best approach to hiring. Now, okay, I'm silly for starting this off with a fairy tale as a comparison to hiring, but when you think about hiring, it actually has a lot in common with dating, except it's dating on a deadline. Because you go online, you look at somebody's profile, you see maybe some interesting keywords, and you think, oh, maybe. You reach out, you schedule a date, an interview, whatever you want to call it, and then after the equivalent of maybe a couple of dates, we have to decide, essentially, if we want to wake up to this person's toothbrush in our bathroom every morning. It's a big commitment. I mean, maybe it's not for life, but it's at least for a couple of years. And we spend an awful lot of time with our colleagues, our bosses, our employees. And so this is kind of a nerve-wracking process. You know, it's nerve-wracking for employers. It's nerve-wracking for the candidates, because everybody has a lot to lose. This is a high-stakes game. Now, employers have a couple of particular anxieties in the hiring process. The big one, of course, is I don't want to make a mistake. I don't want to hire the wrong person. Because, well, worst case, you hire somebody who's a little out there, and they're not a good fit for the job, and you have to fire them, and it gets all very dramatic, and lawsuits ensue, and all sorts of bad things happen. But even in the case where you make an okay hire, that's still kind of a lost opportunity, because you have limited budget, you have limited time to invest in hiring, and do you really want to build your team out of people who are just okay? Probably not. The thing a lot of employers should be worried about that maybe they aren't is missing out on good candidates. Now, how many of you have found it easy to hire designers? No hands in the room, right? Not one. I would be really shocked if there was one, because we would all flood to you and say, what is your secret? Because it's tough to hire good designers in this market. There's a lot more demand than there is supply. Now, 10 years ago at conferences, we were basically saying, oh, woe is me, if only they understood how important design is, and they would hire us all. And these days, it's, holy moly, we don't have enough designers, what can we do to find more of them? So companies should be worried about filtering out good candidates too early. And this is actually a pretty common phenomenon. So if you take the average HR person who's accustomed to looking through resumes for keywords, they're going to look for certain keywords in resumes, and they're going to miss people who maybe don't look like a perfect fit because they don't have the right words on the resume. And your job posting might be filtering people out too early because of the words you use. Not everybody's going to sign up for the design ninja job. Not everybody's going to join you based on how you position your hire. And so how do you keep those doors open wide? Now, of course, it turns out that design candidates have these same anxieties. They don't want to make the wrong choice either, because it's a missed opportunity if they do, and they don't want to miss out on a good opportunity either. So how do we make this design dating game a lot more effective? So I've been hiring designers and design directors for, I don't know, 17, 18 years now, something like that. And I don't want to say that my experience is generalizable to everybody, because it's not. It's dependent on your context. Depends on the size team you have, it depends on the industry you're in, depends on the resources you have, the existing skills in your team, a whole lot of things. But in hiring in different contexts and helping clients, I have learned 5 or 6 things that I think are pretty generalizable. I'd like to share those with you today. You might disagree with me, and if we're lucky, we might have a few minutes for questions at the end, and you can disagree with me then if you like. So, first thing that I've learned is that you want to hire with a long-term growth plan in mind. Now, there's this funny meme I hear in startups sometimes, which is, don't make a plan. A plan's just going to change. We don't know what's going to happen, because we might be wrong if we make that plan, and it's wasted effort. Well, if you don't ever make a plan, you're always going to be wrong. So make a plan, make your best guess, and hire to that. Now, finding good people is tough. It can take months. So if you're hiring in response to demand, if you wait until you need a designer, you're going to be hurting for several months, chances are, while you looked for the right person, because that hiring's tricky. So you want to always be in hiring mode. And to do that, you've got to have some idea of what are the skill sets we're going to need on our team over time. About how many people will we need? So you have to ask yourself, over the next 2 to 5 years, what kind of work is this team going to be doing, and how much of it, so that you can start to project ahead what you're going to want. Now, you don't necessarily need to hire, you don't necessarily need to have the plan for exactly how many bodies of what sorts you need right away. But you do need to answer a couple of key questions. One of those is whether you want generalists, specialists, or a combination of the two. Now, if you're going to start with a very small design team, here's one thing I will suggest, regardless of your context, is that you start with generalists. Now, what I mean by a generalist is kind of the Swiss Army knife of user experience designers. It's kind of like staffing a clinic in a small town. You're much better off having, say, a family medicine practitioner who knows a bit about a lot of things, because they can diagnose, they can triage, they can refer out when expertise is needed, but they can do most things to some level. If instead you staff that small town clinic with a dermatopathologist and a brain surgeon, they're going to be kind of bored, they won't be very well utilized, and they also won't be able to handle and triage the vast majority of problems. So small teams need to start out with people who are multifunctional. Now, when I talk about a user experience generalist, I'm talking about somebody who can conduct some basic user interviews and pull meaning out of them. It's somebody who can do some high-level sketches, write some at least clear interface copy, and translate that into pixels that maybe aren't perfect, but at least aren't ugly. I'm talking about somebody who knows how to run a basic usability test and when to do that. They may not be the best at any one of those tasks, but they know when to apply the skills, and they know when their limits have been exceeded and when to pull somebody in. This is the essence of a skilled UX generalist. Now, if you have a bigger team, you can afford people with more specific tools. Now, there's corkscrew on the Swiss Army knife. It's not a thing you want to use if you're opening lots of bottles of wine. There's a pair of scissors on there too, but it's not something you'd want to sew a dress with. You want dedicated tools if you're doing a ton of a specific kind of work. You want greater expertise. What I mean by specialists are, say, people who are just user researchers, or people who are just visual designers, or people who just do mobile. These folks may have deeper skill in these areas, and they may be able to support the range of projects across your organization. Now, you don't want to use them in a siloed way. You don't want to say, all our user researchers are going to go do the user research. No, you want to apply their expertise across the projects, have them contribute, and not build silos in the team. But that deeper expertise is going to go unutilized if you're in too small of a team. So you don't want to hire specialists too early in your trajectory. The other discussion I hear folks having early on is, to what extent are we going to grow our own designers, and to what extent are we going to just hire people who are already skilled? Now, there's a terrible misconception out there, which I hear pretty often from folks who don't actually hire and train designers themselves, which is, let's hire junior people and train them up because it will be cheaper. This is actually not true. They're cheaper at first, but you have to invest time in training them. And in my experience, it takes a good year before you can get somebody fairly junior to really be productive on a team. So that senior person's time has been invested. You've had an opportunity loss of that amount of time. And by the way, once you get that person trained up, well, guess what? They're worth more now. And you need to start paying them market rate or they're going to leave and your investment's out the window. So when you look at the numbers over time, hiring and training junior people is actually not cheaper. It's maybe a wash. That doesn't mean there's not a reason to do it, though. There are a couple of good reasons to hire and train junior people in your team. And one is that, probably the main one, is that a healthy team contains a mix of people at different levels. So if you think about the average, say, mid to senior designer, the primary way that they improve their skills and advance their careers is through coaching junior designers. The best way to master your craft is to teach it to other people. And so if you have people who are, say, 5 years into their careers and there's nobody junior for them to teach, they're stagnating, they're not growing anymore. And they're going to get frustrated and bored and leave. And so guess what? Your team has become unsustainable. So you need to plan over time for a mix of junior to very senior people on your team. Now, what the right ratio is going to depend a bit on your environment and your starting place. But most of the time, I find it looks something kind of like this, which is if you have one pretty senior project lead, somebody with a lot of experience under their belts, who's a good leader and a good coach, if they have, say, 4 mid-level people, people who mostly are functional on their own but need a nudge or some coaching or some support here and there, they can help those people out part-time, and those people in turn can help mentor a couple of junior people, really junior folks who need hand-holding fairly frequently during the day. Now, these numbers could shift a little bit. If you have more senior people in that mid-level group, you could add maybe 1 or 2 more junior folks. But you need a mix along these lines so that you can start to provide growth opportunities for people. But if you don't have folks at that senior level, that's where you're going to have problems. So as Jared says, when people hire the right designers to start out with, they're likely to be more successful. And so the mistake I see a lot of startups make is they hire design at too junior a level initially. And these are folks whose skills are maybe not that fleshed out yet. And if you don't have senior designers in-house, you don't have the skills to mentor them. So that's not a great starting point, okay? So you've got to have folks at all 3 skill levels. Now, another thing you need to know before you ever try to hire a designer is what the market is like. Now, you already know probably that the market is competitive. It's a seller's market out there. Good designers can be pretty choosy right now. They can command pretty high salaries. They have a lot of job mobility. But beyond that, the market is kind of weird. Now, every time I've worked with, say, an HR director or a manager who's not an experienced design manager, they're really puzzled by the nature of the market because it doesn't look like what they expect it to look like. They expect something like this, where the talent pool has lots of people at the low skill level and a fair number of people at middling skill levels and gradually decreases as you get to senior skill levels. They expect something like this. Mind you, just because I'm using graphs doesn't mean this is a quantitative survey or anything. This is kind of just how I think about the problem. So this might not be reality, but it's what I see reflected in job applications and in how people approach hiring. So they expect they're going to see a pretty steady progression of expertise. They expect they're going to see a pretty steady range of salaries. In my experience, the market doesn't really look like that. I think it looks something more like this, where you have some pretty distinct cohorts of people. Actually, I think there are probably about 5 of them based on the job applications I've seen over the years. I want to talk to you about these 5 different groups and what they mean for hiring. So let's start with the big group, the fairly low-skilled group. Now, there are a ton of these people out there. They may seem attractive from a startup standpoint because they're fairly inexpensive. And they're plentiful, so they're easy to hire. If you hire a designer within a week or so of posting a job, there's a good chance you found somebody in this bucket because they're fairly easy to find. Now, I'm going to be a little bit harsh for a second. Somebody has to design all those awful restaurant websites. And this is the group of people who does that, okay? It's kind of mesmerizing, isn't it? Makes you forget that you can't find the address or the hours or the menu because it's moving. It's kind of astonishing, really. So somebody has to design these right? These are folks who, for the most part, have mastered some tools, okay, because they think design is about tools. They think it's about, I know Photoshop or I know HTML, and I can put together something that looks like an artifact. It's been designed, right? So there are a lot of folks out there who present themselves to the world as professional designers who just aren't, because they don't have the fundamental skills that make a designer a designer. They don't have the problem definition and the high-level strategic thinking skills. They don't really know how to say, who's the audience, what is it they need, and bring forward those things. They don't know how to prioritize what's going in this set of information, but boy, they know how to make it animate. They know how to put music in it, okay? So yes, this is a little bit rude. I'm sure there are none of these people in this room today, but a lot of hiring managers will gravitate toward these folks because they're cheap and plentiful. And this is not a good idea, because this is what you'll get. It might look sort of entertaining, but is it really accomplishing what it needs to for your business? Well, I don't know about you guys, but when I go to a restaurant website and I see this, I think, too much effort. I'm going to go find a different restaurant, because I don't want to hunt for your hours or your menu or anything like that, okay? So that's the bottom group. Now, at the top end, there's several cohorts up here. And I think of them as skilled specialists. So let's say pretty senior user researchers or pretty senior visual designers. They're a little bit easier to find usually than skilled generalists, individual contributors who are that Swiss Army knife of UX design. Those are pretty rare folks. And then, as you'd expect, really skilled team leads are probably the least common and usually the most expensive in this group. But these people do exist. They tend to be expensive. They tend to take a while to hire. It takes patience to find these folks, but they are out there. So the tricky part of design hiring is this cohort in the middle. And this is the one that gives people fits most of the time. So there's a pretty large number of people out there whose skills may be pretty decent to start out with, but they're still developing. They're still learning and growing, and they have a lot of room to improve. And there's a group of people whose skills are kind of spotty. Maybe they're strong in some areas and weak in others. And these people I lump all together in this some expertise but not a ton category, because what that means is, as a hiring manager, you need to give all of these people some level of support. And there are a lot of these people out there. And differentiating which kind of person you're interviewing here is really the hardest part, but in some ways the most important aspect of design hiring. But the confusing thing is, this is not just people who are recently out of design school. I would say, by the way, anybody who's about 5 years out of design school probably still belongs in this cohort, regardless of what senior job titles they might have on their resumes. Title inflation, by the way, is rampant in our industry. Until you can start to teach other people, you're not really senior in the functional sense. Sure, I'll give you the title on your resume if that's what I need to do to hire you, but really, 3-4 years out of school, they're still learning and growing quite a bit as designers. But the difficult part is you've got people in this cohort who are maybe 10 or 15 years in the field. And that's kind of confusing, because HR managers and recruiters and candidates all tend to conflate experience with expertise. And in UX, that is just not true, okay? They assume, I've been in the field for 10 years, I'm an expert. I wish that were true. It'd make hiring so much easier. But the reason for this is that not all years of experience are created equal, and the environment somebody's in my experience, makes a big difference. Okay, so here's one of those points you might disagree with, but I find it's pretty consistently true. So let's say I'm looking at 3 candidates for a position, and they all have about 5 years of experience. One of those candidates has spent all 5 of those years in a mid to large design consultancy, one that I know, that I have some respect for. What I usually find is that those people will come out of that 5 years at a design consultancy with some pretty solid craft skills. They can do some layout, they can do an interview. They wouldn't have survived 5 years in a reputable consultancy without some of those skills. They would have been fired long ago, because consultancies usually get rid of people who aren't performing fairly quickly. So that's usually a pretty good sign. The other reason I think this person is likely to be valuable to my team is that at a consultancy, they've had a chance to work on a pretty wide range of problems. And they've learned a lot by doing that. What they've learned is how to adapt. They've learned how to pick up new design problems and new tools. They've learned, well, probably how to define problems, even if they're still doing that with some help from senior folks. So this is an encouraging thing to see on a resume. Now, an even more encouraging thing to see on a resume is if I see somebody who's had a pretty strong apprenticeship in this consulting environment, but has also had in-house experience. At a big company, small company, doesn't so much matter. But if you've spent your entire career in consulting, well, there's a little bit of a reality distortion filter that goes on there. If I could wave my magic wand, I would make every consultant go spend every 5th year or so in-house, because it teaches you humility, among other things. Things are harder in-house than they look from outside as a consultant. You have so much to negotiate, you have a shortage of resources, and you know, in the consulting world, if you're at a design consultancy, designers are the center of the universe, because the designer billable hours are the profit of the company. And there are not a whole lot of product companies where that's the case. Designers have to fight for resources with other people, and it's a really different mindset. And you're a better consultant or a better in-house designer if you've experienced both of these worlds. So this I get really excited about when I see on a candidate's resume. But I'll tell you, of 5 years experience, the one I get least excited about is somebody who has spent all that time in little teams in startups. And this is something you have to be aware of if you're hiring into a startup. A lot of folks will say, well, I want somebody with startup experience. And there's a good argument for that, which is that startups are kind of different from 10,000 person companies. You don't have the resources, you have to make stuff up as you go along a bit more, and that's all valid. But the problem with people who are in startups is that they're missing some things. So this is not 100% true, I'm generalizing here, but most of the time, when I see folks who I think of as lone rangers, right? They've been the individual designer on a team, the one designer, or one of maybe 2 or 3 people at about the same skill level. Maybe they've been in that environment for a while. So they've learned some things. They've learned some valuable lessons from doing that. They know how to work pretty independently. They've had to learn to some extent how to define problems, or they wouldn't have survived. But they might still be doing some pretty bad design and not actually realize it, because nobody is coaching them in their craft skills. So what I find is that sometimes the Lone Ranger skills are kind of like Swiss cheese. Between Swiss Army knives and cheese, apparently I have a Swiss thing today. But what I find is that these folks may have really good, even outstanding skills in some areas, but you know, for somebody with 5, 8, even 10 years in the industry, sometimes I'll look at the holes in their skills and be a little bit surprised. Oh, they really don't know how to do that. That's interesting. And that's because they haven't had the mentoring. Design it's a craft. It takes an apprenticeship model, honestly, to really hone your craft and to get very good at things. So these folks are a little bit riskier hires because they're going to have some gaps in their knowledge. Risky is maybe not the right word. They can be terrific hires, but you have to know what you're getting. So I've had some terrific luck hiring these folks, and in fact, if you're going to build good design teams, you have to hire these folks. You have to be prepared to help them fill the holes in their skill set. But the one challenge with this group is I see a problem with this group more often than I see in other groups. And that is inflated self-assessment, okay? When you have somebody whose skills are at the kitty cat level, but they see the lion in the mirror, this is the world's worst hire, except for people who are really evil, but there aren't many of those in the world, right? So I can coach for skill. Almost any skill I can teach somebody. And my design directors can teach somebody. I have no worries that we can teach people how to do user interviews, how to think conceptually, how to draw icons, whatever. We can teach almost all of that. We can certainly teach Photoshop and other things like that. What I can't teach you is to self-assess realistically. So if I've got somebody who thinks they're all that, I don't want to hire that person, because not only will they not be open to constructive feedback, they'll resent it actively. And that's going to eventually become kind of toxic in the team. So this is the challenge with folks who maybe have been in the industry a while, but haven't been in environments with good mentoring, is they may not recognize that there are holes in their skills. And I don't mean to be harsh to these people. I think they just don't know what they don't know. Okay? But as a hiring manager, I find this is one of the challenges that we face. So what can you do about this? Well, I wish I had an easy answer for those of you who aren't designers, but it takes craft to assess craft. There's nothing I can tell you today that's going to make an engineering manager or a product manager or somebody else really be able to tell the difference between a so-so designer and a really solid designer. I'm confident those people can usually find the really awful designers and rule those out. They might be able to find a really outstanding one sometimes, but really assessing craft is tough to do if you don't know it yourself. So what can you do there? Well, something I do with my clients is I spend a few hours with them just assessing their candidates for craft. They can assess soft skills, they can assess culture fit generally pretty successfully, but they can't assess craft. It doesn't take very long, though, for me to look through somebody's artifacts and say, maybe, definitely not, pretty strong. And that's something I can do pretty quickly. So find somebody whose judgment you trust, who is experienced in this realm. Use your network to do that. Maybe somebody will do you a favor over some coffee. Maybe you need to pay them for a few hours of consulting. But get that external perspective, just as you would, I don't know, personally, I would hate to have to hire an engineer. I can detect the really horrible engineers, but beyond that, I really couldn't tell you how good they are at coding because it's not my area of expertise. Okay. Now, on the other side of the hiring table, candidates. Those of you looking for design jobs, okay? So keeping in mind that these expectations make a big difference, ask what the plan for growing the team is. Ask if they're looking at generalists, specialists, and so on. Try to understand what your role would be in that team. Are you meant to really deepen expertise in an area? Are you expected to teach the rest of the team a skill? Are you expected to be a Jack or Jane of all trades? What is the role there? How are they planning to grow that team out? That's all very reasonable. Be honest with yourself, first of all, about where maybe your skills are Swiss cheese. Because what that means is that when you say, I am really awesome at this, you're much more credible if you also say, well, I can do that in a pinch. Okay, so be nuanced about your skills. Don't just say, I'm good at everything except I'm too much of a perfectionist. Please, no, don't do that. Okay. And be willing to make a trade-off. Okay, so if you're a designer who's been maybe in a tiny environment and you're moving into a little bit bigger one where you're going to get more mentoring, well, they might not believe your senior title, for example, is accurate. Who cares, right? When you move into a bigger organization, your title generally gets graded down a notch. That's usually negotiable, not a big deal, but think about the learning opportunity that you're trading for. My brother has spent his career in the military. He's retired as a general now, so. But it's been really interesting to watch how the military has managed his career over time. Because what he's done is he's alternated essentially between staff positions and command positions. So he has a position where he's in charge, and he learns leadership by doing it. But then he's in a position where he's working with a more senior leader than himself and learning from them. And he's alternating back and forth throughout his career. And we want to do that as designers as well, where we're in a position to lead and we're in a position to learn. And we're trying to get both of those, okay? Now, one last thought about the market. Education does make a difference. Now, in this industry, there are a lot of folks who maybe don't have formal education, and there are a lot who do. And folks who don't hire these people may not quite know the difference between, say, an HCI degree and a design degree. They're certainly related, and HCI is foundational to good design, but they're somewhat different philosophical mindsets, right? An HCI degree tends to be, again, I'm generalizing grossly here, an HCI degree tends to be very analytically focused. A design degree tends to be more generatively focused. So you kind of need to think about which of those is a better fit for the kind of team that you have and the problems that you're solving. Likewise, it'll serve you well to pay attention to where people went to school And as you interview people over time, you'll form impressions of the different schools and what they tend to give you. I'm not going to name names because I want you to form your own impressions, but if there's a certain school I see on somebody's resume, I know I'm probably going to get somebody who is strong in user research and maybe service design and a bit weak on hands-on interaction design. Another school, I know I'm going to get people who are super creative, but maybe aren't pragmatic problem solvers. Another school, I know I'm going to get really good analytical people who can usability test the heck out of anything, but design, so-so, okay? So you're going to form impressions over time. Pay attention to that because there do tend to be trends. Okay. So that's all the stuff you want to do before you get into hiring for a specific position. Now, when most of the companies I've worked with get ready to hire, usually what happens is somebody writes down a list of bullets and says, this was a draft job posting, circulates that around, gets some comments on it. Well, let's see how well that works, shall we? I went onto a UX job board yesterday and pulled down the first description I see. So here's what I found. UX designers connect people with products and services in meaningful, enduring ways. So this is what they think the job is. Are we using Velcro or what? I don't know quite what this means. Are we getting people married? As a candidate, I'm not sure about this. I would bet the internal team isn't quite sure what that means either, but they think it sounds good. Formal education in visual, interactive, UX, or industrial design. Well, this, as a candidate, this tells me an interaction designer didn't write this, because only if you've been in advertising do you call it interactive. So that tells me something about the level of sophistication of the people maybe writing this job description. And as a candidate, I'm a little confused because, you know, visual and industrial design, man, those are pretty different fields. What is it exactly they're looking for? And I have to wonder if these folks know. Ooh, that was interesting. No? Okay. Using somebody else's remote, hit the wrong button. Sorry. Okay, so proven foundation in industry standard design processes. There is no such thing. I dare you to find anything called an industry standard design process that won't immediately result in a days-long heated Twitter debate. Because we do something in this industry that we call DTDT because we do it so much, defining the damn thing, okay? So this is not something that is real. What does this actually tell you as a team that's doing hiring? What are the particular techniques you're looking for somebody to know? Be specific about those. Proven innovative vision. Well, does that mean I'm good at generating crazy ideas? Does that mean I'm good at actually getting them built? What does innovative vision mean? This is very buzzwordy, and it would be hard to evaluate a candidate against it. Demonstrated written and verbal interaction skills. Interaction skills. Is that even something you're allowed to do at work? I don't know, sounds iffy. Communication, is that what they're getting at? Knowledge of HTML and CSS. Well, let's say I'm conducting an interview with a colleague of mine who's an engineer. Now, as a designer, sufficient knowledge of HTML and CSS means they kind of know what's easy and hard to do and what's going to drive the engineers crazy. To an engineer, knowledge of HTML and CSS means they can actually build stuff with it. So what's the expectation there? This isn't going to align your team around who you want to hire, nor is it really going to set a clear expectation for a candidate. Experience working in an agile environment. Agile, fall, water, scrum, whatever that means, right? Who knows? Everybody's flavor of agile is kind of different. What is it about working in an agile environment that's important? What's the thing you actually care about? Because just saying agile doesn't mean a whole lot. And then visual design experience, particularly in layout and information design. Okay, this is the most useful point in this entire bullet list. Page layout. As a designer, I know what that is. I can evaluate that. That's very concrete, okay? So this is a little bit fuzzy for candidates. It's okay if your job posting isn't perfect, but the key thing here is I will bet you lunch. Of course, there's lunch paid for, but even so, I would bet you lunch that the internal team does not have alignment on what they're really looking for here in terms of the skill, okay? And that's essential to hiring well. So what I suggest is before you write this job posting, you make two lists. The first list is what are the things you actually want this person to accomplish? What are their responsibilities? This is the job description. This is the thing you'll use to set expectations when they start the job. This is the thing you'll use to base their performance reviews on if you do those in your company. This is what you'll give them feedback on. So this is things like creating wireframes, conducting user interviews, doing usability tests, presenting work to stakeholders, filling the coffee machine, whatever those expectations are. This is what you actually want accomplished by this person, okay? But these don't really make great interview assessment criteria because it's hard for someone to demonstrate in an interview that they can conduct an interview with a user, okay? You're not gonna really be able to observe that. Instead, you need to make list number 2, which is what are the skills they need to actually accomplish those responsibilities. These are your hiring evaluation criteria, okay? This is the stuff they actually need to be able to demonstrate to you for you to make a good hire. And then finally, what you do is you turn these into your job posting. Now, this sounds very processy. Those first 2 things, they don't have to be great big documents. This can be you guys sitting down at a whiteboard for an hour, making a couple of lists, taking a photo of that and mailing it around to everybody who's involved in the hiring process, okay? It can be very lightweight. The key is that you have this conversation and you really think about the skills that you want in somebody. Now, when I talk about skills, what I don't mean is knows Photoshop and CSS and Balsamic and Axure and whatever, not tools. Tools are stupid hiring criteria. As a candidate, if you list a bunch of tools in your job posting, what that tells me is that you think design is a tool jockey job. That is not going to get you the best candidates applying for the job because they want you to value their core skills, okay? Likewise, I see jobs that basically say, you have to have designed a product exactly like ours. Well, good designers know how to adapt to different design problems. I would much rather hire a super duper designer who's only designed big complicated systems and have them work on a consumer mobile app than have a mediocre designer who's only ever done mobile. Because there will be a learning curve, but I know that that really good solid designer is ultimately going to be more successful. Okay, so focus on the core skills. And what I mean by that is things like, can they define the problem? Do they know how to really understand user needs and communicate those to the rest of the team? Can they come up with conceptual solutions? Can they design at the system and service level? Can they design at the hands-on level? Can they do visual design? Now, which of these skills matter most is going to depend on your environment. Of course, you're all going to prioritize these a bit differently. But this is the kind of skill that I mean. Now, these are still a bit tough to assess. If I sat down and I said, well, what does it mean for someone to be good at visual design? You and I might have pretty different views on that, right? The key here is to make the skills as granular as possible, okay? So define them in fair detail because they're much, much easier to analyze. Let me give you an example. If I say I want someone with problem definition skills, well, what that means is they know what questions to ask of stakeholders and users to get the information they need in the first place. Knowing what questions to start with is absolutely key. If they can't do that, they're going to need a lot of coaching. Can they synthesize multiple perspectives? Can they pull meaning out of a big messy pile of data? And rather than saying, here are the 20 things I learned, can they say, here are the 2 things I learned that are really important? Can they bring others along in that thought process? Rather than saying, here's what I learned, here are my conclusions, can they say, here's what we learned, and here's what it probably means? Can they negotiate an agreement among all the stakeholders about how to proceed based on what they learned? That, to me, is what problem definition skills are. Now, if you list these things out as your interview evaluation criteria, it's going to lead you to ask different interview questions, and it's going to lead to better conversations with your colleagues who are helping to interview people. Okay. You also want to define at what level do you need each of these skills. Now, the 4 levels I usually find useful are, do they at least know what it is? Do they understand the basic intent and concept, even if they can't do it? Can they do it with some hand-holding? Can they do it pretty independently? And can they actually teach it to other people? Now, in startup land, if you have a very small team, you need people in those last 2 blocks on most skills. because there are a lot of things you can't teach. Now, there are going to be some non-craft skills, like, say, presenting work. That's not really a design-specific thing. You can mentor that. What you can't mentor as a non-design leader in a company is layout and visual hierarchy and things like that. You can't teach the craft skills. So lay out these detailed things and look at what are the absolute gotta-haves, what's nice to have that you might be willing to fudge on. Because what this is going to do is it's going to leave the door open a little bit wider. It's going to let you say, okay, here's a person who maybe isn't perfect, because the unicorns don't really exist, but this is a person who covers most of the needs. And all the areas they're weak in, these are things we can coach in, or we can train in, or we can get an outside resource to help coach in at worst, okay? So the other benefit of laying this stuff out as very specific kinds of skills you're evaluating for is this helps correct for a common evaluation problem in inexperienced hiring managers, okay? So if you take, say, a senior designer who hasn't hired a lot of people, or actually anybody who hasn't hired a lot of people, they're going to suffer usually from something called the similar to me effect. What that means is they're going to look at that candidate and they're going to evaluate that person's skills against themselves right now. So very often I'll have a designer join some interviews, and at first what they'll say is, well, we shouldn't hire that person because I'm better than they are. Sometimes that evaluation isn't completely true, but in any case, the conversation I have is, well, but are they better than you were 2 years ago when we hired you? What were your skills like 2 years ago? And then they say, oh, yeah, I guess I probably was at about that level, you're right. Okay, so we want to make sure people are evaluating against the same standard and not against themselves and not against the wrong set of criteria. Okay, so we want to focus the evaluation process on the skills that you actually need and not on people's random thoughts about who they like and what kind of person they want to fit. So portfolios, of course, are where people tend to start. But here's the thing, portfolios are bozo filters. They don't prove anything. Well, they maybe prove that you know how to use type or how to lay out a page. They may prove that you know how to tell a story, which is good, that's important. They don't necessarily prove to me whether you know how to design. Because a portfolio is usually the result of a team effort. I can't really tell what you did, what other people did, okay? So a portfolio helps me weed out people who definitely won't work. But it doesn't necessarily convince me. Same thing with a resume, okay? The other issue with portfolios is there's something called the aesthetic usability effect. Now, the designers in the room, you probably know what this is. The aesthetic usability effect happens with humans as well as software, by the way, means that when we look at something that's kind of homely like Craigslist, we expect, that's kind of clunky. It's not necessarily going to be great to use. And then we look at something that's prettier like iTunes, and we expect it will actually be easy to use, even though it's a steaming pile of crap, okay? But we're more forgiving of Apple because it's pretty. Okay, so this happens with portfolios. It's kind of the dribble effect, right? There's a lot of emphasis on pretty individual screenshots, and by the way, if I see another screenshot pasted into a shot of an iMac or an iPhone, please shoot me now. That actually makes your portfolio harder to evaluate because it makes the screenshot smaller. I really can't even see your work. All I know is you know how to Photoshop it into a picture of an iMac. Good for you. Okay. So the dribble effect says, I can do pretty screens. I can lay them out in a pleasing way. It doesn't actually let me see in your portfolio, do you know how to solve the problem? Did you solve the real business problem? Did you get results? People have learned that they should try to show process in their portfolios. But what they end up usually doing is demonstrating to me that, that they buy Post-it notes in bulk. Because I see photos of lots of Post-it notes on the wall, and that really tells me absolutely nothing about the decisions they made, the things they considered, the things they would do differently next time. So candidates, when you're creating a portfolio, give me less photos of Post-its, give me less shiny screenshots. Tell me more about what were the goals of the project? What was the problem you were trying to solve? How did you go about solving it? What worked about that? What didn't? What was your role in the project? You know, what did you contribute versus what did other people contribute? That helps me gauge which part of the work to focus on. What were the results of it? What were the lessons you learned from that project? Because no project is perfect. chances are what shipped isn't really what you wanted to ship, so what would you do differently next time? Okay. Finally, we get to interviewing. Now, as high stakes as hiring is, you'd think we would be better at interviewing, but the average tech company I see, the interview goes something like, hey, give me the recap of your resume, which I could have read on my own, thank you. And then they ask a couple of vaguely defined random questions. And then they end with some question that they think is clever and very revealing, like, if you were a tree, what kind of tree would you be? Which tells them absolutely freaking nothing, but they think it's cool, okay? This is a crappy interview. What this does is it tells you, oh, is this somebody I can envision having a beer with on Friday? And that's really the wrong reason to hire, okay? Effective interviews use something called behavioral interviewing. And it's just like a user interview, actually, in the sense that we don't want to focus on people's opinions or their speculation about what they would do in fictitious situations. We want to focus on, tell me about a time when this happened. How did you handle it? What did you do? What would you have done differently? Okay? Tell me about your actual behavior, because it's the best predictor of your future behavior. And by the way, don't hesitate to ask people to show you. Ask them to present their work. Make a persuasive case, because you want to see if they can do that with stakeholders. It's okay to ask them to do a design problem at the whiteboard. Yes, that somewhat biases it toward people who do well under pressure, but if that's a real part of your work environment, that's okay too, okay? You gotta form a holistic picture of people. And you have to remember in the interview process that this is a two-way conversation. They're interviewing you just as much as you're interviewing them. And my clicker is stuck, okay. So when you're asking questions as an interviewee, also do behavior-based interviewing. Don't just believe them when they say design is important. Ask about how projects have gone. Ask about how decisions get made. Ask about how many resources they're really putting into design, and see if what they're saying is true is true. And then lastly, you want to be real to close the deal with the right company as a candidate, to close the deal with the right candidate as an employer, okay? You want to make sure that if you do have concerns, you're not hiding those. If you think, oh, I'm not sure this person will be able to do this aspect of the job, sit down and have an honest conversation about that, right? It'll set your relationship up for better success later on. And finally, don't forget to say, I'm excited about you on either side of the table. Because if you can't honestly say, as an entire team, wow, we really want this person to be part of what we're doing here. We think they will make us better and smarter. Then maybe this is the wrong hire. Hold out for the next person. And if you can't say that about a job, do the same thing. Wait for the next one, because it's not worth it. Because you have to wake up to their toothbrush every day, remember? Okay? So it may not be the right fit if it doesn't feel right. So be objective as you can. Be very detailed about your assessment criteria. But also, when your gut says not quite, listen to that as well. All right, so thanks for listening. This is where you can find me. All right.